Now, along with just looking at the two-way table, we often also want to make some displays out of that, some actual graphs that give you a little more visual idea of what's going on. So one option is a side-by-side bar graph, which really is just you make a bar graph, and to show that second variable, you have more than one bar. So, for example, this is a frequency bar graph. A lot of times these side-by-side bar graphs, they'll make into relative frequencies where these are percentages, but the numbers here are fairly small, so I just made a frequency side-by-side bar graph. But basically what I do is, for this one, I decided to have the sports be my main like categories along the bottom. And then within each sport, I'm going to have a bar for the male. So I have one bar that goes to 40 because there were 40 males who said football was their favorite sport. And I'll have a bar for the females that goes up to 12. Then I do the same thing for the next sport. I have 22 males who said basketball. I have 16 females who said basketball. Then I have 15 males who said baseball and 45 females who said baseball. So it's a two-variable graph because I have one variable on the bottom. Within each of those, I have my other variable measured with different bars. Now, you could do this kind of in the other order. You could have a bar for male, like males and females along the bottom, and you could have three bars. You could have, under the male label, you could have a bar for football, a bar for basketball, a bar for baseball, all side by side. And then above the females, you could have a bar for football, bar for basketball, bar for baseball. So when you're making a graph out of these, there's not like an automatic, oh, you have to put a certain variable on the axis and the other one your bars. But this is one example of a side-by-side bar graph. And the nice thing is, when you're just staring at numbers, sometimes it's hard to see trends. But we can clearly see here some things like, oh, well, basketball tends to be the closest between the genders. There is definitely a much higher preference among females for baseball and a much higher preference among males for football. So it's a lot easier to see some different trends and things that are going on, but pretty straightforward to make. The last one we're going to look at in this video is a segmented bar chart. A segmented bar chart is one that shows categorical data most often as a percentage of the whole. I will show you a couple questions I've come across where they did it with counts instead of percentage, but that's much less likely. So, kind of like that side-by-side bar graph, a segmented bar chart could be in two different ways of looking at it. You could have a bar for each sport. So I would have a football bar, a basketball bar, a baseball bar. And then you would divide that bar up based on what percentage was male and what percentage was female for each sport. You also could have a bar for each gender. So I have one bar that represents all the males, one bar that represents all the females, and then divide the bar by sport. And that's what we're going to do in the little example here. So this bar represents 100% of the males, and this bar represents 100% of the females. When you're doing with this percents, it doesn't actually matter if there are a few more males in your survey than females because we're doing it by percentage. And then what I want to do is I want to figure out, all right, where should I divide this off so that I can show what proportion of the males prefer football. So I'm going to put a little dividing line, and I'm going to use shade in that area to show what proportion of the males likes each of the sports. So one of the first things we need to do is now calculate these percentages. So when I look at that male bar, I need to figure out the percent for 40 out of the 77 that prefer football, 22 out of 77 that prefer basketball, and 15 out of 77 that prefer baseball. And then I need to calculate those two into percent. So I just need to divide. And be careful with your rounding. If you're careful with your rounding, you should end up with this things totaling 100%. Sometimes if it's off by a decimal, you just double check your rounding. But so in a minute when I mark these up, I'm going to want to divide this. So a little over half my bar I can label as football. A little over a quarter of the bar will be basketball, and a little about a fifth is baseball. And then I'll do the same thing for the females. So for the females, it's 12 out of the 73 females prefer football, 16 out of the 73 prefer basketball, and 45 out of the 73 prefer baseball. And there are my percentages there. Now, how you label them, as long as we can clearly tell where your marks are, you don't need to be perfect on exactly where those fall. But you should try and estimate as close as you can. For the male bar, it might look something like this. Now I'm doing it with color because it's easier on computer. You can do it just by labeling. You can do it by shading if you want. Um, the only thing I would say is when you go to label the other bar, do it in the same order so that you have football lined up above football, basketball in the middle, and then baseball on the right. It just helps to compare a little bit. But kind of like with that side-by-side bar graph, the nice thing about these is we can compare pretty quickly and see some of those trends. Like clearly there's a much larger piece of, or larger chunk of the female in the survey that prefer baseball. Males tend to be more preferred among, or football tends to be the most preferred among males. So you can see some trends a little more visually. They're a little bit more work to make because you need to do some dividing up. But it's still a relatively quick graph to let us look at two categorical variables at the same time.